I am super excited. Joining us right now is a very, very dear friend and colleague for many, many years in campaigns. Her name is Amy Walter. You've seen her on television before. She is the publisher and editor-in-chief of the Cook Political Report. And she's been doing this for a long time, even though she looks like a spring chicken.
Oh, I was hoping you would say that, Jamal. Thank you.
She's been doing this for a long time. She knows a lot about politics, and she knows a lot about our topic at hand, which is the gender imbalance, the sort of gender divide that is taking place right now in American politics. So, Amy, welcome to Trailblaze.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
All right. So you are here, and Nayera is going to hop in here in a second, but I just want to ask you one sort of scene setting question. We are seeing in this debate, obviously, we just had the vice presidential debate where we had two white guys on the stage in the vice presidential debate for the first time in 8 years. And now we're sort of looking at this big divide that's happening between the Harris-Walz ticket and the Trump-Vance ticket around men and women. We're seeing them split up. Can you just walk us through what that looks like?
Yeah. And, the hard thing right now, Jamal, is that we are getting a whole bunch of, it's not necessarily conflicting data, but there are some polls that show that there's a really significant gender gap, and others that show the gender gap being kind of what it has long been. I mean, we've had a gender gap now. I think we go back to the Reagan eras where it really started, isn't that right? So with Democrats, with women voting more Democratic and men voting more Republican. But you could kind of see how the seeds were sown for this gap this July at the RNC. I think the pick of J.D. Vance in the very first place was a sign that the Trump campaign felt pretty confident, not just about the fact that they were leading then the candidate they're running against, Joe Biden, but that they were going to lean into Trump's strengths, specifically this idea of strength and masculinity, and pick in J.D. Vance somebody who really wasn't put on the ticket to appeal to a broader group of female voters, but to win over Midwestern men, especially working class men. Didn't have to just be white men, really looking to expand into younger men of color as well. And I will just never forget that final night of the RNC when you had Hulk Hogan, Kid Rock, the UFC fight guy, Dana White, and somebody turned to me and said, boy, he's really trying to win over those women voters, isn't he, with this lineup, right? Like,
it reminded me of WWE. It reminded me of everything that I loved when I was 14.
Yeah.
But nostalgia.
The only thing missing was Baywatch. That was the only thing missing from that discussion was Baywatch.
Not for nothing, though, right? This idea that there is those cultural touchstones from Gen X, right? And then, younger siblings like me who are like, oh, yeah, I remember all of these things. My older brother was watching. That was a big thing. And slowly over time, I came to realize, oh, there is a different way that men can appear in public. And also there's a different way. Oh, there's spaces for women. And this is part of why I rewatched things like Porky's, the movie, which was hilarious back then. I'm like, ooh, wow, that's...
I don't advise that to people.
I think we call all of that date rape now.
I don't know that I could do that.
Right? And it's so
bad.
This is that demographic that never left that moment in time and wants to keep that moment in time. And plus, the women who, for whatever reason, supported that, were involved in that, still do, right? The 52% of white women who voted for Trump before, okay, it dropped down to 48%, but this idea of actively talking about women's rights and feminism does not appeal necessarily to white women voters as a demographic.
Yeah, and the cultural touchstones beyond just the Hulk Hogan and Kid Rock and whatever, but it's a sense of, again, it's a Making America Great Again, right? Of this is a country that we feel comfortable in, and this is the type of country in which we would not feel comfortable. Mm-hmm. And that is, a lot of the the messaging that Trump puts forward, again, a lot of it is what we think of as traditionally appealing to traditionally male voters on the idea of strength and toughness, but also it's this idea that women are also attracted to that, because what it's saying is he's going to protect a certain way of life, protect what it means, in my view, to be an American against these forces outside, whether it's Kamala Harris, whether it's liberals, whether it's woke, whatever it is, that will come in and take that from us.
Well, that's
So
the whole
I'm going to say something
trad.
controversial for this
Just say one
particular
second.
group.
That's the
Yeah.
whole trad wife demographic, right? The trad wives on social media and Instagram who are in their 30s and they're living out this dream and showing soft, fuzzy photos of what it means to be the wife at home on a farm with kids.
Yeah, so that's the kind of exploitative version of it. But I will offer that I think that there is a version of this that progressives buy into too, or people who would vote for Democrats buy into, which is this idea of men as, you know, their economic providers, or at least they're economic contributors in a major way. They protect their families, they protect the women in their lives. The question is, how do we define that protection? Right? We have defined that protection like, I'm going to put a veil over your head and nobody can see you, or I'm going to hide you away in the house so you can't go outside. Or we define that protection as like, I'm going to protect the right for you to take care of your own body and have your own health care. I'm going to protect your right to earn a living without people harassing you when you go to work. Right? So that's the place where I think where men are being challenged. When you're in a space where there are other men and they are doing things that are affronting women, your responsibility then is to still protect those women, but to protect them by stopping those guys from assaulting them, right? Like, that's your job.
You know, what's been really fascinating in watching this campaign play out through the eyes of my now almost 18-year-old son. So he will not be old enough to vote. The poor kid doesn't turn 18 until like a week after the election.
Wow.
But, you know, seeing his generation, right? These are the youngest of the Gen Zs who are able to vote, who have known really nothing but Donald Trump for most of their conscious life. And also seeing the way that he has become what normal politics is. So that's number one. It's a good reminder that what we know of politics in the before times is is not necessarily going. It does not translate to folks in that age group. And the second is just how different the information streams are for not just generations, but for that group's male and female, younger, for younger people. Mm-hmm. The Taylor Swift endorsement, I think it was something that everybody was talking about. Oh, this is going to be a great way for Taylor Swift to win over young voters. For the guys that hang out with my son and my son who he hangs out with, and the stuff that they're watching, the YouTube channels and the Instagrams and all of that.
Yeah.
There's a lot that is that's more Trump centric.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Taylor Swift thing is not surprising to him, because it sort of reinforces what's already being sort of put out there in the world, which is the women who want more women in power, who are already empowered themselves, are going to endorse Kamala Harris. But the guys who maybe they're on the fence about this, maybe they just they're not particularly interested in politics, but they sort of see the election through the lens of how other guys are talking about it, not how women are talking about it, right? And so reaching those younger men, I think, is even more challenging, because the ways that they get information are these very, very niche,
Targeted.
I mean, you're going to go on the podcast. I see the vice president doing more of these podcasts that are,
Yep.
again, more male focused, but like the guys who are talking about video games. That's, I'm sure, where a good percentage of Gen Z voters are listening to the dudes who are telling you how to get through different levels of video games.
Right, because you're sitting there watching Twitch. You're sitting there watching Twitch. You're watching someone else play a video game.
Yeah.
And talking to each other while someone else is playing a video game.
But
right?
you're talking about, what I love about this is that they're also talking to each other while they're doing it, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
So, yes, I'm talking to you about this game, but I'm also saying, hey, did you guys know blah, blah, blah? Did you hear? Or, somebody's from a different part of the country and they start saying, oh man, the floods came through our town. Really? Oh, right. So they are having conversations that go more broadly than
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This is the
So I want to
idea
ask you
of
one more question before we go. Go ahead, Nayara, and then I'm going to ask you a question about the big issue on the table of this election.
third spaces, right? The idea of it, where you have other places to go to build community and connection. And for young men, that is very heavily online. That's also Robert Putnam talks about this, the idea of loneliness increasing and how loneliness becomes opportunities for radicalism. All of this is academic theory. However, we all three of us immediately jump to video games as a dude space. The majority of gamers are girls. That's the majority of gamers right now, right? And so they are sitting there side by side with these guys, wrestling with these issues in real time. And what we don't know as olds is how much campaign advertising on the Democratic side, too, is spent in places like Fortnite and Animal Crossing, right? To have these characters and things pop up. So there is an awareness that's there, but it's disconnected from our awareness as this.
No, that's a very good point. That's a very good point.
Of our, as a rising class of middle managers and people in charge, that this is something pervasive that is not just about a specific campaign moment, that this generation is struggling with many of the same issues that Gen X did. They're just doing it in a totally
different way. 100%. 100%.
All right, I want to ask you one question about the big elephant on the table before we let you go. Is abortion going to have the same impact in the 2024 election that we saw it have in the 2022 election, where Democrats were able to stave off big losses in the House and gain a Senate seat?
Yeah. So my take on this is that it is still very much of a motivator. And so I think for the lower propensity voter who would be a Democrat, but is maybe feeling not great about the economy or still has questions about Harris, or for whatever reasons aren't particularly motivated to vote, this could be the motivator. What I don't think it is the kind of thing that takes a swing voter, that person that right now is saying I'm undecided or I'm third party curious. I don't think it takes them into one camp or the other. I do still think that bottom line issues for so many of those folks are their own sort of economic security and the feelings, as we started this conversation, about who could be a good leader, who can I trust that at the end of the day is looking out for my family, is looking out for my success, is not going to leave me behind. And that for them, abortion, I think they are, at least when I look at in our own data, who these undecided voters are, they're predominantly pro-choice. And I think Harris has already won. First of all, she doesn't need to win the argument with them. But is it the salient issue in which they're deciding their vote? No.
All right. Well, Amy Walter, we want to thank you for joining us here on Trailblaze. It's so exciting to have you. Thank you for being here.
Take care, guys.
That was a fascinating conversation we just had with Amy. And once again, hilarious that we are talking about an entire demographic and they're not sitting here at the table. But I do want I want all of our listeners to understand that we do hire white men behind the camera all the time. We value diversity here at Trailblaze. But in all seriousness, right, this is a challenge of campaigns on who do you pay attention to, right? White union workers were a long-standing thing for the Democratic Party, and that doesn't seem to be the case right now, Jamal.
Well, look, I think white union workers are still a thing for the Democratic Party. As my friend Stephanie Shryock likes to remind me constantly, that when we think about these white working class voters, we're thinking about some guy sitting at a diner with a lunch pail, right? And maybe we should be thinking about that woman who also thinking about that woman who's a couple seats over, who is trying to figure out if she can work an extra shift because she's got to get her kid picked up from childcare, or whether or not somebody is the helpers at her mom's house make sure she's getting her insulin shot, or whatever the other concerns are that she has in her life. So, or whether or not she's got bodily autonomy. I mean, it's something we've talked about on the show in the past. So these white working class voters are actually lots of voters, but it is still true that we've got to pay attention to the concerns, not just of white working class men, but we've got to pay attention to men. I think the Democratic Party and the progressives have spent a lot of time being focused on, these big progressive issues that we all care about. Are we going to make sure that we're going to have health care? Are we going to make sure there's going to be diversity and inclusion? We're talking about abortion and choice and those questions. But then there are other questions that men have, like, are we going to be able to make enough money to support our families? Are we going to have a strong defense to make sure the country is safe? There are a variety of questions that are on the table, and the Democrats just have to be, I think, a little more pointed in talking directly to men.
But you're talking about actual policy communication as opposed to this emotional communication that we're seeing really taking over. The idea that of working with fear, right? So Kamala Harris talks about the fear of a woman bleeding out in a parking lot because she couldn't get access to a health service. Donald Trump and JD Vance, I mean, we heard some of this with the debate today, will talk about fear of the idea of inclusion. They've made inclusion something that excludes white men, right? Because it's apparently like pie. There's only enough for everybody. Everything is a zero-sum game. So if that person over there is getting something, that means you're not. And that's a really hard thing to get people to get comfortable with or unpack. And so you'll see white working class, for example, the Teamsters, who did not come out and endorse Joe Biden or Kamala Harris, despite the fact that the Biden administration bailed out their pension fund. I mean, they still have pensions. We don't have pensions anymore. They
Right.
will vote against their own economic interests because there is a cultural dynamic that has been playing out cycle after cycle in American politics.
Right. And that is right. Like, that's the fundamental, I think, cross current that progressives faced, which is, on one hand, American history is what it is, right? Is what it is. I mean, slavery is a part of it, and Chinese railroad workers who were abused, and child labor, and women who couldn't vote, and all these things. I mean, farm workers, like all these things that are a part of it. And frankly, a lot of those institutions were led by white men who were the ones who conducted the slave trade, were the ones who owned the railroads, were the ones who owned the farms. So we can't separate that. And even today, we are talking about a society that we're still, the vast majority of CEOs are white men, right? It's not like if you have more women, more people of color who are going to be involved in the country, that white people are suddenly going to be left out. They still are going to have a huge chunk of the wealth, a huge chunk of the power positions. The question is, are we going to have a country where everybody has an opportunity to compete? Everybody has an opportunity to play. And we're not going to fall back to those old tribal, exploitative ways that governed human behavior for most of human history.
Well,
Are
we
we
already
not going to go
have.
back to that?
I mean, we already have, right? Like, that's the reality when people talk about polarization in America. It's about tribalism and how you view us and versus them. I do find it fascinating, though, this idea that white men, especially young white men, now identify as a somewhat of a persecuted class. I mean, that these are really strong words, but the idea that they are missing out, they have to think twice before they can talk to a woman when that wasn't the case before Me Too, right? All of these ideas of, oh, white male is not the default in American society anymore. That is no longer the only mainstream. And while I feel for that, I also want to say, welcome to the party. This is how the rest of us have been working all
this
along.
Is what I'm getting at. This is what I'm getting at. That's the cross current I think we're trying to figure out, right? So on one hand, the American history is what it is. We want to do better. In order to do better, we got to be better, right? We know better, so we got to be better. At the same time, there are these cultural touchstones that I think, we have to be mindful of, right? People still like to watch football on the weekends. People still like to go hunting with their kids and their families. People still like to, listen to country music. I did a lot of politics in the South. I know you've worked in political campaigns that were based in the South. A lot of that is just cultural, like these touchstones where we can get together on the weekends. We can listen to the music that we might like. We can watch a game we might like. Maybe it's a little too violent. We can go out hunting, and nobody's going to look down their nose because we like those things. So you ought to be able to do that. But you don't need an AK-47 to go hunting, right?
Unless you have
we can
feral
talk about
pigs.
Football, and we can still talk about like what do we do for traumatic brain injuries, and how do we make sure people aren't like going to kill their families because they've been hit 5,000 times starting at the age of 9. Like we've got to figure out how we can have these touchstones and still have a society that works.
Well, but that's some of where this generational change, I think we're watching it and seeing it happen, from us and our children and, college students who are in between that age, this idea that this awareness of other people's experiences and the understanding that there are some limitations that come with living in American society. I remember in elementary school ages ago being told my freedom ends where yours begins, and that's what it means to be in a civil society, in a democracy. But there is
freedom. I think the phrase I love is your rights end at the tip of my nose.
Sure.
Right? You can do whatever you want to do,
of that.
but you can't hit me in the nose, right?
Or do things to my body, which apparently people can. The idea, though, that young white men are being targeted by these disinformation campaigns or just, negative campaigns, particularly to tell them that the practice of democracy doesn't work for white men. Take a listen. This is a clip from Brad Bauman, who he launched the White Dudes for Harris effort. And he's talking here at a conference about a 70-year-old white union worker. Take a listen to how he relays this story.
And you could just tell that on the one hand, he was grappling with this media environment that he is deeply ensconced in. The Fox News, the AM radio, the constant din of these hosts who are basically telling this community that they need to be afraid of everyone and everything around them all the time, and that the only answer is to turn your back on democracy and support Donald Trump and the group of weirdo fascists that are, surrounding him. But at the same time, he senses that something is wrong, deeply wrong with what they're saying and what they're doing. And there is this moment right now where we have an opportunity to move some of these folks off the limb, off the ledge.
What Brad's really talking about here, and to give him credit, he gives the caveat that he's not saying that the Democratic Party needs to exclusively focus on white men as a class of their own that is oppressed, right? He's not going that far, and he totally recognizes that there are all sorts of places where money should be spent, but that we can't ignore the idea of loneliness, of suicide rates that are increasing in men, the idea that young men gather in online spaces to find social and human connection now. And that is a direct target for these messages that democracy is failing and you're better off, not only with the Trump administration, but you're better off when you get to decide everything for yourself.
Yeah, the other place where young men are gathering, there was a great story in the New York Times recently. I think you're making a really good point about religion. The reversal in Gen Z, Christian men are more pious than women. Young men more religious than their female peers. So 40% of women say they are religiously unaffiliated, even if they think of themselves as being faithful in some fashion. They're unaffiliated with a formal institution. But only 34% of men say the same. And in every other age group, men are more likely to be unaffiliated than women. About 2/3 of women between the ages of 18 and 29 say most churches and religious congregations, unquote, do not treat men and women equally, and they rebel against that. And the last thing I'll say about this is, there's a guy named Derek Rishmawi who leads a ministry at UC Irvine. For some young men, Christianity is perceived as one institution that isn't initially and formally skeptical of them as a class. And that is the thing I think you're talking about now, is like these men who feel like they are by default guilty just because of their skin color and their gender. And they are wondering if there is a place for them in the sort of the new America, the America we're becoming, the thing we talk about. Is there a place for these young white men in that America? I would say the answer is yes. There is a place for you to be there. There is not a place for you
And
to oppress people.
it's not that
There is not a
it's
place
not
for you
that
to offend people.
progressives
There's
or
not
the
a place
Democrat.
for you to, well, hold on. There's not a place for you to oppress people, offend people, or to do people harm. And I think as long as we build like a culture around values that we can all agree on about mutual self-worth, then I think we ought to be able to include everybody in that.
This is what the irony is about the whole snowflake idea, right? It's like, oh, the Trump campaign brought up this term that, oh, your feelings got hurt, or, you can't take a joke anymore. I'm like, well, that whole thing about a snowflake, literally it's white melting stuff. Like it's the young white men or middle-aged white men not having been told or taught how to handle their feelings and how to behave in a way that is inclusive to other people in society. That's the thing that's being denied now. It's not anything else. And that the loss of that privilege, we haven't said that word so far, I'll say it now, the loss of that privilege feels like oppression. And ... is that then what still drives campaigns to fund different initiatives, the types of firms that they hire, right? Like all of this, the work that you're doing into building a winning coalition, that is the Trump-Vance coalition right now, standing at 47%. That is not a winning coalition of just white dudes, no matter what the age and education range, without other people coming along. So who do they bring along with them then?
Yeah, they've got to bring them along. The danger for the progressive side is that we don't find a way to be inclusive of the cultural touchstones. One of the things that's been gnawing at me recently is the way that we talk about Tim Walz and Doug Emhoff, and we describe them as like the new masculinity. And I don't know that I like that, because it others them in a way, right? Is like there's this masculinity which is bad, right, or it has trouble, and then there's this.
Oh, you mean the toxic masculinity that that term of toxic masculinity?
Right, which I think is dangerous because it starts to then bleed over to like, is masculinity itself toxic, or is there a form of masculinity that is toxic? So this idea of like the new masculinity, I think is wrong. I would use a different phrase. I would just say the conditions have changed. We have a new America, and so the same things that animate you as a man can still animate you, which is that you want to protect your family. Doug Emhoff, the first time we ever saw Doug Emhoff was when I remember when he ran up on stage in the 2019 campaign, when some guy tried to come at Kamala Harris on stage when she was running for president, and he jumped on stage and grabbed that guy and pushed him back, right? Because that's what men want to do. They want to protect their families. If you want to support your family and make sure they have all the best opportunities to be able to live their lives, that's what he's doing with his wife. He's supporting his wife to make sure. Now, in the old days, maybe that support was like, oh, you just went out and earned all the money and gave her the chance to go to the PTA meeting so she could do whatever, like all of that stuff, which I think didn't exist in my family. That didn't exist in my family.
Let me sign a credit card over for you, hon, so that you can go spend my money. Please, I'm being generous by allowing you to have a credit card.
Absolutely.
That's a data point
so maybe
from 50 years ago. That is in our parents' lifetime where women could not get a credit card on their own.
Exactly. But the idea, so people have this idea that that's what they're thinking. But there's a new way to support your family, which is to help your wife go to work and to make sure that she's able to like work late when she needs to, so that you're taking care of your own children and making sure that, that the family is sort of functioning in a way that everybody is living up to their full potential. But I don't want to talk about it like it's a new way to be a man or a new masculinity. It's just a new America. And so we're all learning how to do new things, not just men. Women are learning how to do new things too.
I would not mind, though, returning to the era where men wore stockings, because I got to tell you, the amount of running around and athletics y'all do, legs look good. And they age well. So I would wholeheartedly support some of those fashion trends where men had to wear slightly uncomfortable clothing. But I do hear what you're saying about this idea of
ties. That's our sacrifice to the clothing gods, is we have
just
to
like,
wear nooses around our necks.
at least they're voluntary now, Jamal. Oof, oof.
This is true. This is
The
true. There's a great Amiri Baraka play about this, which is the Dutchman. He's like, I wear this tie around my neck to keep from, putting it other places. So it's a good. It's good. So yeah, so we're figuring out this thing about what's going on
masculinity,
with the
right?
dudes.
The masculinity, and then how do you talk to people and connect with people? And I don't want to, drop off of our little stoop conversation we're having here without connecting this dot of however much people want to dismiss, trans people are not a quote unquote threat, right? That bathroom use, all of this, it's not a physical threat. It's not trans people are taking something physically away. It is a threat to this idea of gender norms, right? What men look like, what women look like, how they should behave in those boxes. And it is very potent, right? It's a very potent thing within the right wing community, within some conservative church circles and religious circles writ large, and that's right. We just dismiss it as culture wars, but it's a very deeply rooted identity challenge, and it's fascinating to see who's been able to change over time in hearing and more of the exposure and pivot to this idea of you do you, I'm going to do me, and that's okay. Like, we're good. But,
yeah,
right,
look, the trans issue is a gateway drug, right? Like, it's just a way for them to begin to make an argument about how, because it doesn't really affect that many people, right? It's not like we're talking about
it's not a literal threat, but they're like, oh my God, are you going to, like people freak out about it.
Right, but they use it as a gateway to be able to say, they are going to take away all these things that it is that you value, and so some of that is like they is us, right? Like and they are, even the kind of more wealthy, more educated men who don't associate the same way you do. They eat arugula salads, right? Instead of iceberg lettuce, or they eat vegan burgers instead of a slab of meat and beef that like the rest of us want to have on the grill. Like, there's this way of othering the part of America that they don't feel that, a lot of these working class guys don't feel very attached to. And here's the danger. It's not just happening to working class white guys. It's also happening to Black men. It's happening to Latino men. Like, this is a thing that is happening with men in America and the progressive movement. We got to figure out how to include people and not just divide them.
Well, it is going to have to come with some accepting of change, right? And that's, at the end of the day, I do think this is a change election, particularly when, you have two candidates who neither one of them's the incumbent, but that idea of what are the changes are, how are you going to deal with them? What's the prescription the people in charge are going to give the country to move forward, right? That the idea that change is coming, and it's not going backwards, no matter how much people resist.
Absolutely. And remember, JD Vance has been calling Tim Walz effeminate. Like, literally, they're going all the way in, right? They're not even like using the dog whistles. He's like, he's this gesticulating effeminate man. What's effeminate about Tim Walz, right? The guy was a football coach. He was in the military for 14 years. He was a teacher. He's, he's this big sort of burly guy. He likes to fix his cars and do all this. And likes football. He just went to the Michigan-Minnesota game. Like,
right.
He's like very traditionally male in many ways.
The thing
he just
that they
works
hone
for
in
a
on,
woman, and I think that's the thing they're going for, because
I think
works for a woman.
He's happy working for a woman. Right? He's not sitting there grumbling. He's happy working for a woman, and he's very comfortable expressing care, right? He talks very passionately about caring for children, feeding children, like all of these things that they really want to eliminate this idea that caring or caregiving can be part of a male identity, but also that's part of government's responsibility, is to care for the people.
Right. That's a lot. Listen, I think this is obviously not going away, because we are going to be talking about these trend lines for a long time to come, especially if this election turns out and it jumbles up the math on some of these places. If that happens, this is going to be something we talk about for a long time after the election's over.
I'm not surprised that white men will continue to be a topic of conversation, Jamal. But if folks want, if you want to hear more about what we have to say and some of our previous conversations that Jamal and I have here on Trailblaze, please subscribe, sign up, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen to podcasts, and of course, give us a good rating. 5 stars would be welcome, and we look forward to having our little catch up, Kiki Stoop conversation next week.